Welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast. My name is Omri Johnson, your host. Season 3 of the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast will be focused on opening up dialogue about a way forward in the diversity and inclusion space that's focused more on who we are than what we ascribe to one another. It will be about shifting patterns and practices we've come to adhere to in the space, examining them with fresh eyes in the current climate, about principles the work has revolved around and why and what principles we might need to consider anew, about exploring our thinking, how we are making meaning of our workplaces and the world around us in the most curious ways we can, how we listen with skill, openly learn, create the conditions that allow colleagues to know they matter. Greetings, folks. Welcome to the Reconstructing Inclusion podcast. This is Omri. I'm solo today. What if we knew what we know now? How differently might the work have been conducted? That's what's been on my mind. There's been tremendous uncertainty about what diversity is, what inclusion is, and how these concepts actually serve organizations. I'm not talking about the fact that there's been multiple definitions about this. I think right now, a lot of people just aren't sure when people that are opposed to DEI or anti-DEI, that made their career out of being anti-DEI and they don't want it to go away. What do they mean? They don't know. And a lot of the times, unfortunately, even those that are pro-DEI or pro-inclusion mean specific things, and it hasn't always worked out well. So what if we knew what we know now? How differently might the work have been conducted? We're in a fascinating moment to work that out, because here's what I understand is true. The more uncertainty we face in the world, the more diversity of thought, perspective, and approach we need to navigate it. These two realities, uncertainty and diversity, aren't just coincidental, they're interdependent. I had a conversation recently with a colleague that crystallized something that I hadn't fully articulated before. He said, organizational purpose has been usurped by organizational optics. Think about what that means. For the past several years, too many organizations approached inclusion work or DEI work as optics management, doing just enough to avoid pressure, to prevent distraction, to look like they were on the so-called right side of history. Minimal investment, maximal visibility, but not the kind of work that changes fundamental structures, shifts collective mental models, or actually builds the capabilities organizations need for their people and the organization to thrive in complexity. Purpose got buried under optics, and we're all living with the consequences. He went on to assert that I, meaning Omri, have been at times too steeped in obscure terms that only others who work in the organizational development or inclusion and diversity space are familiar with. I had to agree to an extent, but I pushed back a bit. But, he was probably right. He doesn't work in the people development space, yet he is a trusted advisor, both an advocate of the way I have done this work and a critic of what he has seen related to the industry over the past 4 or 5 years we have known each other. This podcast episode has been heavily influenced by our last 3 conversations, particularly the most recent one, and contains my reflections of our dialogue and a reflection of experiences that I recalled when working to make sense of what emerged during and after we spoke. It goes without saying that politics is always at play in organizations. That's just reality. People use actions and behaviors to gain power, influence decisions, and advance interests. I've worked in corporate environments and as a consultant for long enough to know this is a constant and is unlikely to change. After George Floyd's death during the pandemic, there was a window of opportunity that hadn't existed before. Many people moved into that vacuum with the conviction that they had the expertise, or at least the passion, to address what they saw as quote unquote structural racism. That impulse was understandable, but it was done without fully grappling with trade-offs, which I have talked about multiple times. What they did, instead of enrolling people in a conversation about what organizations structurally needed to change, there was a tremendous amount of energy talking about the structural problem of systemic racism. Now, I'm obviously not denying that racism exists or that people racialized as non-white or Black have dealt with profound challenges historically and today when it comes to racism. What I am saying is that as a system, there are and were many other dynamics at play beyond racism alone. But systemic racism became the explanation for everything. I want to be somewhat facetious. I stubbed my toe. It was systemic racism. I got bumped by a car. It was because the person driving was racist. I'm being facetious, but that's how it occurred in too many cases. Almost like it was like a joke, like an Eddie Murphy skit or a Richard Pryor skit when Saturday Night Live could be a lot more racy than it can be today. So I watched this whole dynamic unfold in real time. I'd be on calls, right? I live in Switzerland, so I was often remote and I could see the whole room sometimes. Like half the senior leaders would be on their laptops doing email. Occasionally they'd chime in. They weren't fully engaged. And when I'd have one-on-one conversations with them afterward, pattern emerged. Sometimes I had those conversations before, but the pattern remained the same. Some were actively opposed to what was being called DEI, DEIA, DEIJ, whatever acronym the organization landed on that week. They told me directly, this isn't helping to the extent people wanted to help. And what I learned was that these actively opposed people were actually helpful. I learned from them. They'd say things like, we spend too much time on how people feel and it hasn't changed anything. They weren't diminishing feelings. They were saying, we are temporarily massaging feelings without getting at the heart of what would actually create different conditions. But there was another group. I'll call them the passively opposed. They'd make ambiguous statements. They'd ask derailing questions cloaked in neutrality. One person told me, my group is fine. We're like the United Nations. We all get along and focus on getting our jobs done. They weren't trying to get to the heart of anything. They weren't sharing their actual mental models. And here's what surprised me. The passive opposition was a far greater derailer than the active opposition. The problem was, in many cases, the DEI practitioners that I encountered, most of them focused on social justice and anti-racism, didn't listen well to either group. And many practitioners passionate about DEI were uncurious when people came with opposing views, even though many of them appreciated diversity in all its complexity, not just the racialized type. Oftentimes, practitioners, we didn't engage. We didn't ask questions. We didn't find out what they actually believed and why. That left people feeling like this was a lost cause. And if they had enough power, they'd either shelve it or eliminate it entirely, which brings us to where we are now. The storm we're in didn't come out of nowhere. It was brewing between 2022 and 2023, especially as the affirmative action case headed to the Supreme Court. Instead of recognizing that as a signal, we fought the storm. One of my best friends, his name is David Aaron Warrington. He's kind of a shaman himself, but he told me something. He said, this was in the process of my first marriage dissolving. My ex-wife had gone and it was difficult. And he was trying to take care of his buddy just like he always has. And he said, Omri, your wife is like a tornado and you're no shaman. So Omri, you have to run. Now, I'm not saying we should have run from the challenge that took place during the pandemic when it comes to DEI or from the notions of racism, but I am saying that we should have been more shaman-like, watching the storm as it brewed, understanding it, using wisdom to mitigate it, rather than building up opposition to the opposition. All that created was what Howard Ross calls a conversational network of contention. I spent the past couple weeks reading and rereading Thomas Sowell's book, Social Justice Fallacies. You don't have to agree with Sowell. He's a conservative economist if you're not familiar with him, but he deals with facts. And every practitioner in our space should read this book, not because it will tell you there's no injustice and no racism. He never claims that, but because it shows how the way we often address inequality puts us in positions opposite to what we intend. Let me give you a few of Sowell's fallacies that are directly relevant. One, the chess pieces fallacy. This is the assumption that people from different groups should be distributed proportionally across all outcomes and positions, as if we were interchangeable pieces on a board. But people aren't chess pieces. We have different interests, different preparation, different choices shaped by culture and circumstance. When we see statistical disparities and immediately conclude they're evidence of discrimination without examining all these other factors, we're committing this fallacy. Disparities don't equal discrimination. That's a hard one for a lot of us in this space. Disparities don't equal discrimination. And worse, when we try to engineer proportional outcomes, which a lot of people take equity to be, which I never have, but understand that that was something that a lot of people believed. I didn't even fully understand it until I started talking to people about equity. And they're like, yeah, it's equal outcomes. I was like, whoa, you really think about that? Let's go a little deeper. Does that actually help? A lot of people didn't necessarily respond. But when we try to engineer proportional outcomes, we often create the very resentment and division we're trying to eliminate. The next fallacy is the zero-sum fallacy. This is the belief that one group's gains necessarily come at another group's expense. This showed up constantly in so-called DEI work. The assumption that addressing historical disadvantages for one group meant taking something away from another, but organizational capability isn't zero-sum. When you build genuine inclusion skills, the ability to manage complexity, navigate difference, create conditions for thriving, everybody's capacity expands. As Alex Edmonds would say, the pie gets bigger, it grows. We can grow the pie. The third of these fallacies that are relevant is the knowledge fallacy, perhaps most relevant to our work in inclusion. This is the assumption that decision makers have sufficient knowledge to successfully engineer outcomes. We acted as if we could design the perfect intervention, call it how to be an anti-racist or white fragility or whatever. I know I pick on those two a lot, but they're the ones that everybody else picks on that's against the so-called anti-DEI. I wish they wouldn't have become the poster child for everything that our work shouldn't be, but they did. And I can say that without any hesitation at this point. I won't apologize. I can be unapologetic and full-throated. Those were words that were thrown around a lot. I'm going to say that about Kendi and D'Angelo-esque ways of thinking. Look, we acted as if we could design the perfect intervention, the right training, the correct policy that would produce the culture we wanted. But cultures are emergent. They arise from thousands of interactions, informal networks, unspoken norms. Top-down engineering rarely produces what we intend. It usually produces unintended consequences we didn't anticipate because we couldn't possibly know all the variables at play. These fallacies were embedded in much of the DEI work that was happening. And when people pushed back on them, we didn't, as a collective, engage with the substance. We labeled the pushback as resistance or fragility. And you know what happened when people get labeled as that. Bad. It was unhelpful. In fact, it was harmful. Why do we have the resistance or so-called backlash today? We have to accept some of the responsibility, if not majority of it. It's not comfortable to do, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't have done it. So I asked, what if we knew what we know today, what would you have done differently? I'm going to answer that question for myself. What would I have done differently? So given what we're experiencing now, if I knew what I know now, what would I have done differently over the past 5 years? First, I would have agreed with what was true. As the pushback emerged, I would have acknowledged the legitimate critiques. Let me give you an example. The Free Press, Barry Weiss's publication that I think is now owned by CBS, wrote about Richard Bilski's Bilkstow. I think I pronounced his name right. I don't want to disrespect him. Bilkstow, a teacher in Toronto who was in an anti-racism workshop. He pushed back on something the facilitator said. Instead of engaging with him respectfully, with dignity, she shunned him. She shut him down and used his statement as an example of what not to do. His statement was reasonable. He didn't deserve that treatment. And I think if someone had treated a person of color that way, nobody would have accepted it. But because he happened to be a white male, it was somehow justified. The tragic result was that Richard Bilkstow lost his job as an administrator and ultimately took his own life. He had vulnerability in that moment. His identity, his belief in what he did and how well he did it was shattered. Education was his life. You don't have to agree. But the facilitator took zero responsibility. She showed a bit of kind of passive compassion that felt kind of like a sense of cruelty. And maybe she didn't say anything because of risk of liability. I get it. But the diversity practitioner community didn't take any responsibility either. We didn't even acknowledge that it was possible that this way of seeing, being, and doing the work of anti-racism was unhelpful to this gentleman who took his life for multiple reasons. I'm not saying that the anti-racism workshop was the only causal reason, but he obviously was hanging on by a thread mentally, and this might have been the nudge. I can compassionately say we had, as a practitioner community, as those who were practicing anti-racism, the way that they did, placing blame on a particular group identity, which was majority white men, did not help Mr. Bilkstow. If I knew what I know now, I would have been more adamant about bringing that up in the practitioner community. I did say something about it, but I probably lost some relationships because of it, but I didn't say it loudly enough. As people start attacking Kendi and D'Angelo's approaches, back to them, I would have said more clearly, yes, those frameworks aren't helpful. They might feel good. People made a lot of money from them, but they weren't going to create the conditions we wanted, even in the short term. They were incense, meaning they smelled good, but eventually died out. I would have engaged with the narrative as it was rather than becoming Chicken Little, running into the cave to hide. I personally was a bit critical and even wrote a whole article. I think I might have had a podcast about Chicken Little and the sky is falling. I wouldn't have gone in that direction because that's what everybody did. Oh, DEI is dying and they're going after it. They're attacking DEI. People might have been right, but it wasn't really an attack. It was really a calling out of it without us really coming back with clarity about, hey, what are you attacking? Let's have some real conversations, because these anti-DEI activists, they're not deep. They're not deep. None of them have really engaged with anybody with depth. They just had a good narrative. It helped them politically. It's made them money, just like the DEI narrative, the anti-racism narrative did. They just flipped it. These folks aren't deep. I've never heard them talk to anybody. They just do talking points. They do social media. It has worked. Now, I would have used data more. I would have had deeper conversations. I would have challenged those opposed to DEI while agreeing with some of their legitimate points, as I shared earlier. And I would have challenged my colleagues more directly. I tried to on social media, but I wasn't as mindful of going to them and say, hey, let's sit down and talk about this, about where we're going. I would have done that differently, more directly about the points that we weren't holding up to scrutiny. As this storm was brewing, we should have been at the center of it. We should have been the shamans, not running after our things as they blew away. Second, I would have reasserted what inclusion and diversity actually mean. What are the relational skills that a well-crafted approach could build? Let's quickly talk about equity. Originally, equity wasn't about equality of outcomes. It was about understanding different situations and making sure people got what they needed to have an equal shot at doing their best work. Wasn't always perfect, and you can't always have everything equal in all circumstances, in all situations. That's impossible. Some people thought they were engineering the future with this term equity, which wasn't helpful. But the intent was to create systems where people had a fair shot, which I totally agree with. But today's definition that has been morphed has drifted into something else entirely. This idea that we should engineer equal outcomes regardless of effort, skill, or contribution. I know a lot of people say, that's not what we mean, Omri, but get that at this point, somehow, some way, this became what it was framed as. It doesn't mean all of us talked about this or thought like this, but this is how it's been framed. That idea of equal outcomes regardless of effort, skill, or contribution, it doesn't even help people. It's supposed to help. If I'm doing excellent work and somebody else from a particular group identity gets more when I was doing better, higher quality work, I wouldn't want that outcome. That wouldn't feel so-called equitable to me. And yes, I'm racialized as Black, and I know people might say that wouldn't happen to me, but it definitely happened to Asians where these policies were demonstrably harmful. I would have been clear, crystal clear. Inclusion, as I define it, is any action that creates the conditions for people to thrive, and that means everyone. I would have been clear about principles, clear about heterodoxy and the value of encountering ideas one disagrees with, a willingness to be influenced by the so-called other. I would have been clear about humanity being the frame, not group identity, about thriving and generative outcomes we could actually measure based on how cultures, teams, and people were behaving and engaging, and obviously, ultimately, business outcomes. I had an analogy there. You know, when people are playing on a football pitch, and I'm going to use European football as the way, like when you're on a football pitch, obviously scoring goals and passing and all that is good. All the stuff that you do on the pitch is things that allow you to win games, but there's a lot of stuff that players have to do behind the scenes to prevent injury. They have to do certain types of physical therapy or physiotherapy. They have to do certain exercises that make sure that they're limber and that they stretch enough that they don't pull muscles or that they don't tear something, that they have their fascia and all those things in excellent condition because they've conditioned their bodies to withstand really slight movements that could make or break you. So it's not all that just happens on the pitch. It's a lot that happens off. And I equate what we do in the inclusion and diversity space as that level of prevention. When people are on the court, on the field, on the pitch, they have done those things that prevent them from harming themselves or harming others in a way because of how they moved or had to move because they couldn't avoid things. That's what our work could be. That's creating the conditions for everyone. The third thing I would have done is I would have been much more prescriptive. This is where the emergent inclusion framework comes in. It's not about engineering mindsets. It's about understanding the mindsets and beliefs people already hold and having conversations about what those beliefs create for us. I would have been really clear that we needed to build up what are called durable skills. I equate those with inclusion skills, with relational skills. These are things like cultural intelligence, not surface level awareness about other cultures, but the actual capability to navigate across difference and similarity of all kinds effectively. I would have talked about and build up things like perspective getting and taking, going beyond empathy to actually understanding how others see situations differently and why they do. Context deepening, understanding the systems and history that shape current dynamics. Adaptability through reframing, the ability to see situations from multiple angles and adjust our approaches collectively. Sophisticated inquiry, learning to ask questions that actually reveal understanding rather than just asserting beliefs. And deep listening, not performative active listening, but the practice skill of genuinely hearing what's being communicated, being able to synthesize that and practicing that over and over again to make sense with each other. These are just a few things that I would have been mindful and thoughtful of, and all of these are a part of my emergent inclusion framework. I would have used approaches to building strategy that brought more people together with the intention to have productive pushback, to talk about what we want rather than just what we don't want in the inclusion and diversity space. What I noticed, most DEI work focused on everything going wrong, usually with certain people feeling they got the short end of the stick. I'm not saying that they didn't. I've felt like I've gotten the short end of the stick when I've been in organizations before. But if this was really about the system, the conversation wouldn't have been just about commiseration over problems. It would have been about When did you feel like you mattered? When did your boss do things that helped you grow? How have you flourished here, and what made that possible? Who helped you feel needed and valued? How did people affirm your contribution in ways that helped you thrive? I wouldn't have ignored problems, but I would have spent more time helping people reflect on how they matter, how they've helped others feel like they matter, and how to create more of those conditions systemically. I also would have spent more time understanding informal networks. Organizational hierarchies don't really reflect how power and influence flow. They are amalgams of relationships happening across the hierarchy that give people influence regardless of their positional authority. And I would have made sure people understand that civility and dignity are non-negotiable. Civility and dignity are non-negotiable. Civility and dignity are non-negotiable. I can say that a lot of times, and I could never say it enough. That we're collectively focused on what we want more of, not just what we're against. That we're building capacity for systems thinking so we can understand how changes in one part of the organization ripple through the whole. What's fascinating for me in all my conversations with executives and influential leaders across industries over the years, the idea of having the capability, the skill set plus capacity to manage the tensions and complexities of difference and similarity has never gotten pushback. Let me repeat that. I define diversity as any mixture of similarities and differences in their respective tensions and complexities. That's Roosevelt Thomas's definition. No executive I've ever talked to has said that that's not something organizations need to be equipped to manage. All of them have agreed. They were clear that as collective human communities, such capabilities weren't in large enough supply, and the need to elevate them is often muted. Further, there's rarely been consensus about what capabilities are needed, how to assess for them, how to reward them, how to build them internally, and how to acquire talent that already possesses a significant amount of them and can constantly get better, so that every new hire could add to the overall capacity across the organizational ecosystem. People understand inclusion skills as a superpower for organizations. You can call them relational skills. You can call them durable skills. There's been a movement for using that term for years. These are the skills that are essential in organizational life. And in this new race with AI as either a great equalizer or a potential divider, I think more and more people see that as uncertainty becomes normalized, the ability to think clearly, understand systems, and have these durable inclusion and relational skills are more critical than ever. Even the AI evangelist, in many cases, would say the same. The times we're in globally make these skills indispensable, despite AI doomsayers talking about job elimination. Usually AI companies hoping for that because it's the only way they can be profitable. These scenarios are being increasingly pushed back on by AI and machine learning experts, especially in academia. There is consensus, however, technical skills plus relational, human, durable inclusion skills equals organizational superpower. The case for inclusion skills perhaps have never been stronger. So what would you have done differently? I want to ask you, given what we're experiencing now around inclusion and diversity, if you knew what you know now, what would you have done differently the past 5 years? If you weren't in this space, what might you have said? What might you have written? What conversations might you have had? What or where might you have thought about things in ways that felt counterintuitive at the time, but with retrospective wisdom, you'd see differently? Maybe it's one of the things you already did. If so, I'd like to hear about that too. This is my last podcast for 2025. It's been an amazingly interesting year. I can say without doubt, I'm stronger because of it. I don't always feel that way every day, but I know something's brewing. We're moving towards a future where inclusion skills, these relational skills that create conditions for people to thrive and for organizations to create what Umar Haque calls thick value, are emerging as essential. Because of AI, because of accelerating uncertainty, the opportunity and necessity are perhaps more ripe than ever. My hope is that in 2026, we come together and continue this dialogue, that we build these capacities more intentionally, that we put in the energy and investment to do that, and that we do all we can to transcend this contentious cycle, keeping everybody stuck across all types of people-related services. I feel confident we can move to the next era of contribution in this space. Happy holidays, whatever you celebrate. Make 2026 a great one. I appreciate you. I hope this was helpful. Make it a great day. Peace. If you are committed or simply a little bit curious about how to make DEI accessible to everyone, actionable, that is, unambiguously prioritized and sustainable, aligned with personal and organizational purpose, hit the subscribe button. Make it a great day. Peace.